Welcome back to the U.S. Navy History Podcast, or welcome if this is your first time. I am Dale, and I am joined by Christoph. Hey, dude.
Hey, Dale, how are you doing? It's so good to be back.
It's good to have you back. Always, every time.
Well, thanks.
Bayonne, New Jersey, the 4th of March, 1942. The country has been at war for less than 90 days. At the Elko Naval Division plant on the waterfront, the same yard that had been turning out small naval vessels since 1893, that had built sub-chasers for the British Admiralty in the last war. The workers are laying the keel of their 7th 80-foot motor torpedo boat. The hull is sequential. One more in a production line that will eventually run to hundreds. The men bending mahogany planking over frames in that building do not know they are constructing the most famous small combatant in American naval history. No one does. She is simply the next hull off the line. Before we talk about what became of her, we need to understand what she was and what problem she was born to solve. Because PT-109 was not a wartime improvisation. She was the answer to a question the Navy had been arguing about for a decade, and she carried the full weight of that argument in every inch of her keel. Here is the question. The Pacific is not the open North Atlantic. It is an archipelago, 1,000 islands strung across 3,000 miles of ocean. Their passages choked with reefs and shallows and jungle coastlines where no fleet chart was worth trusting. The Japanese were using those passages the way a smuggler uses a back road. They were running destroyers down through the Central Solomons at night. Supply runs, troop transfers, the operation that would become known as the Tokyo Express. And conventional American destroyers, big waterships with deep drafts and crews of 300, could not always follow them where they needed to go. What the Navy wanted was something small, fast, cheap, armed with torpedoes. Something that could hide in the dark of a narrow channel, put two fish in the side of a Japanese warship, and disappear before anyone could find it. The concept traced back to Britain. In 1939, engineers from Elko crossed the Atlantic at the Navy's request to examine European motorboat designs. What they found was the work of Hubert Scott Payne, British aviation pioneer, powerboat racer, founder of the British Powerboat Company, and a man who believed he had built the finest small torpedo boat in the world. His 70-foot private venture design, PV-70, impressed the Elko team enough that they bought it outright and shipped it back to the United States under the Navy designation PT-9. That hull became the conceptual ancestor of every American PT boat that followed. But Scott Pine's design had a fundamental mismatch with American requirements. It was engineered around British 18-inch torpedoes. The U.S. Navy ran the 21-inch Mark 8, longer, heavier, and powerful enough to crack a destroyer's back. And those weapons overloaded the hull. In heavy weather off Key West in the spring of 1941, a full squadron of early Elko 70-footers took a beating in 8 to 10-foot swells. Hull planking split. Chin guards ripped away. Bottom framing cracked under the bow. The crews came back reporting what the Navy did not want to hear. The boat wasn't strong enough. What came next was the event the PT boat would never forget: the Plywood Derby. On July 24th, 1941, the Navy's Board of Inspection and Survey sent 7 competing designs out of New London Harbor on a 190 nautical mile open ocean run at full throttle. Elko against Higgins and against Huckins. Ex- acceler- ah, accelerometers in the pilot houses recorded hull pounding. Boats were loaded with copper ingots to simulate combat weight. And during the trial, one Higgins entry failed when those ingots punched through the deck. Elko won. And in the months that followed, Elko took their 77-foot design, stretched it to 80 feet, refined the bow entry to reduced pounding, and produced the PT-103 class, the boat that would go to war. Now, I want to walk you through what was inside her, because this is where my background as a machinist mate has something to say. The Elko 80-footer was powered by 3 Packard W14 M2500 gasoline engines, 12 cylinders each, arranged in a V configuration. Each engine produced between 1350 and 1500 horsepower, depending on the production mark. 3 engines, 3 propeller shafts, 4,500 total horsepower, driving 56 tons of wood and hardware to a designed top speed of 41 knots. That is faster than the destroyers she was built to kill. The hull was 80 feet on a 20-foot 8-inch beam, drawing roughly 5 to 6 feet aft at combat load. The planking was 2 diagonal layers of 1-inch mahogany, a canvas and glue laminate sandwiched between them, fastened through with thousands of bronze screws and copper rivets. Not plywood. That nickname was a joke the crews made and the press repeated. Real timber, real fasteners, in a structure engineered to flex and absorb where steel would fracture. She was fast, she was graceful, and she was carrying thousands of gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline in tanks positioned amidships. Her standard armament in commissioning: 4 21-inch torpedo tubes along the sides, 2 twin-mount Browning 50 caliber machine guns in powered turrets, 1 20-millimeter cannon on the fantail, 2 depth charges on the stern racks. As the war progressed, the class evolved. Heavier gun fits, radar masts, Bofors 40-millimeter cannon on some hulls. But the core mission never changed. She existed to put torpedoes in the water and be somewhere else when the shooting started. And here is where the logic turns on itself. Speed was the entire tactical premise of the PT boat. Speed was survival. Speed was the answer to every question about armor, about protection, about what you do when a 2,000-ton Japanese destroyer starts shooting at an 80-foot wooden boat. But in the waters of the Solomon Islands, the sea answered back. Tropical waters carries bioluminescent plankton, microscopic organisms that glow green-white when disturbed. 3 Packard engines at high throttle kicked up a wake that lit the surface like a signal flare. Japanese aircraft could track it from altitude in complete darkness. Follow the glowing ribbon straight to the hull, and bomb what they could barely see. It had already killed men, The only countermeasure was to throttle back, cut to a single engine, drop to 6 or 8 knots, kill the wake, sit in the dark, and hope the night held. The boat that was built to run became a boat that had to hide. That contradiction, not a design failure, not a tactical error, but a physical reality woven into the hull the day her keel went down in Bayonne, is the thing you need to hold on to. Because when we get to the night of August 1st, 1943, in Blackett Strait, PT-109 will be sitting in the dark on one engine, doing exactly what her crews had learned to do. And the Japanese destroyer is going to find her anyway.
So this is very interesting because when you said 80-foot boat, I was like, that's a big boat. And then I had the idea, when does a boat become a ship? Do you know that? Is there any formal definition that a ship is this powerful or this heavy or this long?
Well, my official answer is in the Navy, every sailor calls everything a boat, but civilians have better call everything a ship.
So is it a PT ship?
For you, yes.
That works for me. That's a consistent definition I can get behind. This is interesting. And this is not the first time that we've seen a ship that is architected to run a certain way, but then when reality hits, it is prevented from running in that way that it is designed. And so it has to adapt. And as we've seen in several previous episodes, the Americans are pretty good at adapting. I'm really curious how this manifests itself. Question about the plankton. Is that something that you would see on your journeys? Like when you were deployed and your carrier was cutting through the water, I'm sure there's a humongous wake that is created. Is that something that...
Well, I was an East Coast sailor. My dad was the West Coast sailor.
Okay.
We didn't have to worry about any of that. And besides, in this day and age, you're going to see that carrier anyway. You don't need plankton to tell you.
Right.
And even back then, a destroyer is not a small boat. It is a big boat. You're not looking for the plankton. You're looking for the boat. But a PT boat is tiny. It is small. It's only 80 feet long. Doesn't have a huge sight profile. So using other ways to detect it is a very good idea for if you're looking for it.
That makes a lot of sense. You had to use every clue at your disposal in order to find whatever you're looking for. And so this could have been the key for the Japanese to do that for such a small vessel, we'll say.
Okay, so also for the official definition between boats and ships.
Okay, cool.
I'll give you the official one. I'm going to take pity on you. A boat.
Thank you.
A boat is a smaller watercraft designed to float, plane, work, or travel on water. Boats can be used for fishing, leisure, or transportation across smaller bodies of water. A ship is a larger watercraft that travels the world's oceans and deep waterways, typically used for transporting goods or passengers. Ships are equipped to handle rough seas and can carry larger loads than boats.
Okay. So this PT boat, I guess that's the other question. How would they get deployed? Because we open the story in New Jersey, right? That's where it's manufactured. That's where it's made.
Mm-hmm.
How does it make its way all the way from there to the South Pacific?
It's shipped there on a ship.
On a ship, of course. Yeah, I guess there's no way it could navigate that itself, so that makes it a boat. Thank you for informing me and the audience at large. Appreciate that. Okay, well, so given that, my questions are out of the way. And I am curious to see why, because everything we've talked about so far in the Pacific Theater has dealt with mostly carriers, some destroyers and cruisers, and then a couple of battleships. And this is the first time I've heard mention of these small craft. So I'm sure they serve a purpose. I'd love to hear more about what it is.
She left Bayonne as a weapon. She arrived in the Pacific as cargo. In August 1942, 6 weeks after her delivery to the Navy, PT-109 was loaded aboard the Liberty ship USS Joseph Stanton and shipped west across the Atlantic through the Panama Canal and into the Pacific. She was not under her own power. She was lashed to the deck of a freighter the way any other piece of equipment gets shipped to a war. Crated, secured, passive. The 3 Packard engines that could push her to 41 knots sat silent in the hull, while a merchant ship made its slow transit. She arrived at Noumaya, New Caledonia, was lifted off the transport, and was repainted, the original navy gray swapped for a flat dark green that would serve her better in the island channels she was about to enter. Then she moved north towards the war. The war she was moving towards was already on fire. By late 1942, the Solomon Islands were the center of the bloodiest naval campaign the Pacific had yet produced. The fight for Guadalcanal had been grinding since August. American Marines holding Henderson Field against everything the Japanese could throw at them from the air and the sea. Supply lines stretched thin on both sides. The waters around the island littered with the wreckage of capital ships sunk in night actions, so numerous and so catastrophic that the sound around Guadalcanal and the Engala Islands had been given a name that said everything: Iron Bottom Sound. It was into Iron Bottom Sound that PT-109 was heading. She arrived at Shashipi, in the northwestern tip of Tulagi Island at the end of November 1942. One of 6 new Elco 80-footers transferred from MTB Ron 2 to form the core of Mortar Torpedo Boat Flotilla 1 under Commander Alan P. Calvert. The base at Sishapi was built on captured ground. Tulagi had been a Japanese position until the Marines took it in August, and it showed. A pierced steel Marston Street ran through the middle of it. Tents and corrugated metal structures housed the men. A crude sign over the main road read, Calvertville. Through these portals passed the best MTB flotilla in the world. It was the kind of sign you put up when you need to believe something, when the conditions around you are doing their best to argue you out of it. The boat's first commanding officer was Ensign Bryant L. Larson, a Naval Reserve officer who had been with the 109 since her delivery in July. At Shishashpi, however, she also carried a heavier presence. Lieutenant Rollins E. Westholm, commander of Motorboat Squadron 2, who rode PT-109 as his flagship. On the first day of December 1942, the same date that will not be lost on this audience, PT-109 did something that does not appear in most accounts of her history. She came alongside the sinking cruiser USS Northampton, torpedoed the night before in the Battle of Tassafaronga, and ferried 96 survivors to safety at Tulagi. 96 men standing in every inch of a boat built for a crew of 12. Before PT-109 ever fired a torpedo in anger. She had already done that. 6 days later, she went to war for real. The night of December 7th, 1942, a date that carried its own weight. Reconnaissance aircraft reported 8 Japanese destroyers moving down the slot. Westholm led 8 PT boats out of into Iron Bottom Sound, with PT-109 as his flagship. The action that followed was, by the numbers, an American victory. The Japanese supply run was turned back without the loss of a single American sailor. Admiral Halsey reviewed Westholm's action report and forwarded a commendation to Admiral Nimitz. It was a different kind of December 7th in American naval history. PT-109 had earned her first blood. January was harder. On the night of the 2nd and 3rd, 2 enemy bombs exploded off her port beam. and a Japanese patrol plane strafed her wake east of Savoy Island after she fired torpedoes at a destroyer. On the 9th, she closed the Guadalcanal beach at first light and raked an enemy supply depot with 50 caliber and 20 millimeter fire. On the night of January 11th and 12th, she joined 8 other PT boats attacking 8 Japanese destroyers off Cape Esperance. An action in which PT-112 was sunk and PT-43 damaged, but not before a torpedo run found the destroyer Hatsukaze and put her out of action. And on the night of January 14th and 15th, the patrol that earned her battle star, PT-109, worked her way up Savoy, searching for 9 expected Japanese destroyers. A patrolling Japanese plane dropped a depth charge 150 yards off her port quarter, close enough that men felt it in their teeth. At first light, enemy shore batteries caught her in range and punched 3 holes in her hull. She limped back with open seams, leaking water into the bilges all the way home, and pulled up to the dock at Calvertville, needing everything a base that barely existed could give her. Hold those 3 shell holes in your mind. The crew patched them in the field, the way PT crews patched everything in the field. Local timber, canvas, whatever was available. The boats were designed with that in mind. The mahogany planking, repairable by base force personnel without a shipyard. It was one of the design advantages the Navy had planned for. What the Navy had not fully planned for was month after month of this, the cumulative weight of it, the tropical rot setting into the hull, the engines running past their service intervals, the men running past theirs. The flotilla was short on manpower, barely enough men to crew the boats, let alone properly maintain them. Malaria was taking sailors off the boats faster than the Japanese were. Dengue fever, dysentery, exhaustion, the Calvertville sign notwithstanding, by early 1943, these crews were running on reserves that had no floor. In February, the Japanese evacuated Guadalcanal in the dark, running 20 destroyers down the slot under Operation KE. The PT boats were in position around Savoy Island. 11 boats ready. The Japanese defensive gunfire drove them back. The express ran through. And with that, the Guadalcanal campaign came to its exhausted close. The island secured at a cost the Navy did not publicize. In the weeks that followed, PT-109 went through her maintenance cycles. Someone scrounged a surface search radar set, a unusual acquisition, since the PT-103 class was not equipped with radar at commissioning, and had it installed. It is unclear how long it lasted or whether it was ever reliable. Westholm moved off the boat to become operations officer for the flotilla. Larson held command until April 20th, 1943, then detached. Ensign Leonard J. Tham held the helm for 4 days. On April 24th, 1943, a 25-year-old lieutenant, junior grade from Boston, who had spent the better part of a year pulling every string available to reach this exact harbor, stepped aboard PT-109 in Tulagi and assumed command. The boat he found had been in the Pacific for 9 months. She had 3 repaired shell holes in her hull. She needed considerable work before she was fit to go out again. She had already earned her first battle star on the waters of Iron Bottom Sound before he ever arrived. John Kennedy had come a long way to find a very tired boat. And what brought him here, the strings that were pulled, the favors that were called in, the back condition that should have kept him at a desk in Washington, is a story that tells you something important about both the man and the moment.
I knew that designation sounded familiar. I was like, where have I heard that? And you just revealed it. I'm like, oh yes, that's right. Kennedy served in a PT boat during this conflict. This is it's interesting because I always wonder about. Okay, so a lot of thoughts going through my head. I know in talking to you as a machinist mate on a ship, what your role, at least what you've told me of your role, the discipline involved, the hours, the drilling, the constant preparation for whenever something can go down. And then in many of our episodes, we've heard the 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 knife's edge of not stress but preparation meets anxiety, and then the moment that a battle commences. And so anybody that's commanding a ship, I would imagine, in any zone of conflict where there are active enemies trying to end your life effectively or destroy your assets or what have you, that's going to be a very tense situation that where we need to rely on a very capable leader. And so growing up, I remember hearing conflicting reports about the capability of Kennedy and how the PT boat was some kind of lesser vessel, and that it spoke to his lack of ability more than his capability. And so this episode is going to help me understand, and hopefully the audience as well, what does it take to pilot such a vessel in these waters with these difficulties? And what did Kennedy himself have to endure during this time?
Here is what John Kennedy found when he stepped onto the dock at Tulugi on April 14th, 1943, and walked to the berth where PT-109 was tied up. The hull was fouled below the waterline. Marine growth thick enough to cost her knots she couldn't afford to lose. All three Packard engines needed a complete overhaul. The wood of the deck and superstructure showed 9 months of tropical weathering. The seams wanting recalking. The paintwork stripped and faded. The crew that met him was almost entirely green, with one exception, the executive officer, Ensign Leonard Thom, the 220-pound former offensive tackle from Ohio State, who at least knew the boat. The other men were new. So was their commanding officer. The boat had earned its first battle star before Kennedy was within 5,000 miles of it. Now it needed weeks of work before anyone could safely take it back out. The 25-year-old lieutenant who stood looking at this needed work would spend the rest of his life explaining why he was there at all. Let me tell you that story, honestly, because it matters. By every standard metric the United States military applied in 1941 and 1940, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was not physically fit for combat service. He had known chronic illness since childhood: colitis, scarlet fever, hepatitis. His spine had been compressed since his undergraduate years at Harvard, the vertebrae degenerating in a way that would worsen throughout his life. When he applied to the U.S. Army's Officer Candidate School in 1940, they rejected him as 4F, citing not only the back, but ulcers, asthma, and other conditions. The Army did not want him. The rejection was not a clerical error. What the Army wouldn't do, the Navy did, but not through normal channels. Kennedy's father, Joseph Kennedy Sr., was a man who had made a career of knowing where the levels were and how to pull them. He had been U.S. ambassador to Great Britain. Through that posting, he had developed a close friendship with Captain Alan Goodrich Kirk, head of the Office of Naval Intelligence. Kirk had been naval attaché in London during Joseph's ambassadorship. When the time came to get his son commissioned, Joseph Kennedy called in that connection. Kirk accepted a certification from a private Boston physician, not a Navy doctor, attesting to young Kennedy's good health. Cough, cough. On the basis of that private certification, John Kennedy was commissioned as an ensign in the Naval Reserve in October 1941 and assigned to a desk at the Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington. Privilege had opened a door that medicine had closed. The desk assignment didn't last. A romantic affair with Inga Arvada, a Danish journalist whose past included personal friendships with senior Nazi officials, which had placed her under FBI surveillance, forced Kennedy's reassignment to an ONI field office in Charleston, South Carolina, in January 1942. The affair ended. His back got worse. He was thin, pale, and in pain. A friend recalled him describing himself as feeling more scrawny and weak than usual. Pearl Harbor had happened. The country was fully at war, and a young man who had now been kept from it by his own body and managed into a desk by his father's connections was now spending his days in the South Carolina field office, and it was not what he wanted. Here is where the second string gets pulled. James Forrestal, Undersecretary of the Navy and an old friend of the Kennedy family, arranged Kennedy's entry into the Naval Reserve Officers Training School at Northwestern University in Chicago. Kennedy arrived in July 1942 and threw himself into 2 months of navigation, gunnery, and strategy. During that training period, a man walked into the school who changed the course of events. Lieutenant Commander John Buckley. Buckley had become a national hero by commanding the PT boats that evacuated General Douglas MacArthur and his family from the Philippines as Japanese forces closed in. He was now touring the country, promoting war bonds. His pitch to the officer candidates at Northwestern was intoxicating. PT boats as the decisive weapons of the Pacific, nimble and lethal, striking at Japanese capital ships and vanishing into the night. What the candidates at Northwestern did not know, and what post-war research would confirm, was that Buckley's claimed sinkings in the Pacific, a Japanese cruiser, a troop ship, a plane tender, were not verified. None of them. The PT boat's combat record against destroyers and capital ships was, to be fair, significantly worse than the program's promotional machine admitted. Kennedy signed up for a service selling a story that was, at minimum, inflated and at maximum, a lie. He completed PT training at Melville, Rhode Island on December 2nd, 1942. His marks were excellent. The school asked him to remain as an instructor. He declined. He was ordered to MTB Ron 4 as commander of PT-101, a 78-foot Huckins boat. And in January 1943, that squadron was reassigned to patrol the Panama Canal Zone. Panama, a post that carried no prospect of combat, no enemy contact, no test of anything. Kennedy spent 3 weeks on the Atlantic coast of Florida, with his squadron preparing to transit to Panama. And then, on his own volition, pulled the third string. He contacted Massachusetts Senator David I. Walsh, chairman of the Senate Naval Affairs Committee, a family friend. Kennedy requested a reassignment to the Solomon Islands combat zone, and Walsh made it happen. In February 1943, while his squadron was still in Jacksonville preparing for Panama, Kennedy's orders changed. He was detached. He was going to the Pacific. He traveled west aboard the USS Rochambeau, a troop carrier, and then transferred to a smaller vessel for the final approach to Tulagi. On April 7th, the Japanese launched their largest airstrike in the Solomons since the early campaign. Dozens of aircraft attacking Allied shipping in the harbor, bombs dropping into the water around Kennedy's transport as he watched from the deck, unable to do anything. It was his first taste of being the target rather than the observer. He arrived at Tulagi on April 14th. 10 days later, he stepped aboard PT-109, and the XO handed him the boat. Understand what three separate political interventions had purchased. A man who was medically disqualified, who had been steered away from combat by his own father, who had spent most of his naval career at a desk or in Panama, was now the commanding officer of a combat vessel in an active theater. A private doctor's note, a family friend in the Navy Department, a senator with a phone call to make. Three strings, three doors that were open the way other men's doors were not. And now he was on his knees alongside his crew at the dock at Calvertville, scraping marine growth off the hull of a boat that needed everything, buying them ice cream at the PX, trying to earn something that had already been given to him. Hold that image, because the water off Blackett Strait is going to offer him a chance to settle accounts.
Okay, so I got questions. First of all, before I ask my questions, I do want to say, as a former asthma possessor, I don't know as someone who has asthma, I could be president of the United States one day. That's very encouraging, regardless of my medical history. That's nice.
Well, the president's not typically put into a combat situation, so...
Right, well, he's not a president now.
That's true.
But I always assumed that if you're given command of a vessel, regardless of size, you have some kind of rank and experience that, you've accumulated over a career in the Navy. If I understand what you're describing properly, that did not happen here. Not that PT boats are given to junior officers or lesser experienced or qualified candidates, but it sounds like he just showed up and was given a boat. Is that right?
That's what happened. But also, you need to
Okay.
keep in mind that the smaller the boat, the less rank you need to have to command it.
Right. I can understand. That makes sense to me. But you called him an ensign, and I'm like, okay. And then all of a sudden, he's in charge of a PT boat. I'm like,
He's a lieutenant.
Oh, okay. If he was, something isn't working for me. It isn't fitting in my head. And maybe it's just not acknowledging the three strings that you mentioned previously and how powerful that can be.
Yeah.
But if you go from medically disqualified to, okay, you're in, at one point do you become a lieutenant? So I guess he did go to Harvard. So one of the preconditions for being an officer is a college degree, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So during this time, when people enlist out of college, are they assigned officer roles, or how does that work?
You still have to go to officer candidate school.
Okay.
So you're still going through military training. You don't say, hey, I have a college degree. I'm an officer now, right? And get command of a boat. You're still going to have to get training.
Okay. So he does that. He gets a commission. And then okay. It's making a little bit more sense, but that's happening awfully fast.
It did. That's what happens when you have a political clout family who pull strings to get their children into these roles that they typically don't ever earn.
Right. How my kids can get ahead. So I mentioned political clout.
Yes.
And then
money. A lot of money.
Lots of money.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm 0 for 2 so far, but those are probably the main two factors. I do find it interesting that he tried to get reassigned to a combat zone in spite of his father's wishes, whom I assume had the political clout and the money. And so he would be the primary person that he would have to go through, just like, hey, can you please help me get this? And I assume his father would have said no, but then I guess Kennedy himself or John Kennedy could have talked to the common family friend in the Senate to get that reassigned. Wow, this is it seems like basic information, but certainly not taught in the history books as far as how Kennedy went from 4F to commanding a boat in the theater. Wow. Solomon Islands specifically also, is that I, why would you want to go there? Is that close enough to the action where you'll see something? Or, I mean, we've talked about Iron Bottom Sound. It seems like probably the most dangerous place to go to for a new commander. Would you agree?
That's where the action is centering around,
So,
right?
yeah,
That during that
he's
period
just
of
like,
time. Yeah.
I want as well.
Yep.
That's commendable.
That's what a lot of guys were like back then. Is like, I want to be right where in the thick of the action.
I agree. Connected roles or posts, I think they would use their connections to get out of danger if my history of watching television and movies has taught me. Probably totally inaccurate.
Some do. Others use their connections to put them right in the middle of everything.
Okay, well this is interesting. I mean, we've been talking about a lot of things that have been happening in and around the Solomon Islands, so he is definitely in the midst of the action. I'm curious to see what happens. I know faintly what I've heard reported about what he was able to do. But oh yes, so the mahogany construction, I meant to ask this last time. One of the basic advantages you mentioned was being able to use and source local timber to replace what needed to be replaced on the boats in the hull, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This seems very specific. Like there's not a lot of like you would have to be in a tropical area for this to work because otherwise you'd be relying on oak or who knows what other planking that would not match well, I would imagine, with how they've made it, correct?
Well, it was designed to be repairable wherever it's operating.
Okay.
They recall your history. PT boats were used very heavily on all the rivers there in the Vietnam conflict as well.
Right. But yeah, another tropical area. So it's not like you couldn't go up the Rhine in Germany and expect, could you repair it with any tree or any type of lumber? I guess that's my question.
Well, wood was used to be repairable instead. That's why it was used.
Oh, okay. I guess I just was getting stuck on the specific type of wood.
Yeah, you are.
My mistake. Yes, I was. I'm glad we agree, and I'm glad we both see that that was a mistake. Listener, it's okay to make a mistake.
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, he's arriving right when bombs are dropping, so what happens next?
It took until mid May to make PT-109 fit to go back out. 3 weeks of work on the hull, the engines, the deck hardware, everything that 9 months of hard Pacific service had stripped down and worn through. Kennedy did not manage the labor from the dock. He was on his knees with the crew, scraping marine growth off the bottom, painting alongside men who were going to have to trust him with their lives. When his back allowed it, which was not always, he had come to this boat with a spine that had already been medically flagged as disqualifying, and the tropical climate of Tulagi was not going to improve it. But the crew noticed that he showed up and that he could work, and that when he could work, he worked, and that he made trips to the PX and came back with ice cream and food for men who had earned neither particular treatment nor the kind of officer who acknowledged that they might deserve any. They liked him for it. Now, let me tell you about the people standing on the dock with him, because PT-109 is not a abstraction. She is 13 men on a 80-foot wooden boat in the dark, and most of them are about to go into the worst night of their lives, and they deserve to be known by name. The executive officer was Ensign Leonard Lenny Thalm, the anchor of the boat in every sense. 6 feet, 220 pounds, former offensive tackle for Ohio State. calm, physically capable, an excellent swimmer. Whatever Kennedy needed done on PT-109 that required someone to set the tone by doing it first, Lenny Thom did. The crew trusted him before they fully trusted Kennedy, and Kennedy was wise enough to know it. Patrick H. Pappy McMahon was motor machinist's mate first class, the oldest man on the boat. Stationed in the engine room, the mechanical mind who kept the three Packard engines running when PT-109 was cut in half in the dark on August 2nd. McMahon was the man below decks, trapped in the machinery space as fire rolled through it. He would suffer burns over 70% of his body and still make it to the surface. Kennedy would tow him for hours through open water. That is how it goes later in our story. Hold that in your head. John E. McGuire was radioman second class, assigned to the communications gear, the man who should have been below monitoring radio traffic on the night of August 2nd, and who instead was standing in the cockpit besides Kennedy. That detail will matter enormously later in our story. Gerald E. Zinser, listed as Gerald in numerous subsequent accounts, a mistake that irritated him for the rest of his life, was motor machinist mate first class, a career Navy man who had survived and retired decades later as a chief petty officer, the last living survivor of PT-109. Zinser died in Florida in 2001. Ray Starkey was torpedo man's mate second class out of Garden Grove, California. William Johnston was motor machinist mate second class, Dorchester, Massachusetts. And Johnston could not swim. He would be lashed to a plank and towed to the island with a man pulling on each end. And then there were two men whose name appear only at the end of most accounts of PT-109. And I want you to hear them now instead before the end, so they are real to you when we get there. Harold William Marney was motor machinist mate second class from Springfield, Massachusetts. He was 22 years old. He manned the forward gun turret, the one closest to the point where a Magiri would strike. Nothing is known of what he was thinking on the night of August 2nd because he was gone in seconds and no one saw it happen. He was 20 years old. Andrew Jackson Kirksey was torpedo man's mate second class from Reynolds, Georgia. He was 25 and Kirksey was afraid. Not the ordinary afraid that every man on those patrols carried. Something more specific than that. Something with a face on it. During the summer patrols, as the boats had taken near misses, as Japanese float planes had tracked the phosphorescent wakes and dropped bombs close enough to shower the hull with shrapnel and lightly wound two of the crew, as Kennedy had sent PT-109 into hard evasive maneuvers with bombs, walking towards a neighboring boat in the dark, Kirksey had become convinced that he was going to die. He talked about it. He could not stop talking about it. He talked about it the way that some men in combat eventually do, when the odds accumulate in their mind and the arithmetic starts pointing in one direction. It was unnerving the crew in ways that a man's fear, spoken aloud and continuously, will unnerve a crew. By early August, at the Rendova base, at the primitive forward position on the Lumbari Split, where the men were eating canned rations in a jungle clearing, where Kennedy had contracted malaria, where rats came through the tents at night, and dengue fever was working its way through the squadron. Kirksey had tied his kapok life jacket tight up to his chest at his battle station, tight to the cheeks, sitting at the gun turret on a boat at the dock during the brief hours when he was not on patrol, in a kapok vest cinched all the way up, as if the water was already coming. On August 1st, Kennedy added a weapon he had spent weeks acquiring, an Army M3 37mm anti-tank gun. Single shop, stripped of its wheels, lashed with rope to a pair of 2x8 timber planks bolted to the forward deck. It was an improvisation in the truest sense. Heavier hitting than anything the 20mm cannon on the fantail could deliver. Faster reloading than a torpedo. Something a man could work at close quarters against the Japanese barges. that were increasingly the 109's actual adversary. The boat's life raft was removed to make room for it. Ensign George Barney Ross, a friend of Kennedy's who had lost his own boat and had been assigned to 109 as an observer, was designated to operate it. That same morning, 18 Japanese bombers found the Lumbari base. PT-117 was wrecked on the dock. PT-164 was sank outright. Two of PT-164's torpedoes were blown off their mountings by the blast and ran hot and erratic around the harbor until they finally beached themselves without detonating. 2 men from other boats were killed. The base was still burning when Commander Thomas Warfield met with the skippers of 15 PT boats that evening, gave them their orders, and sent them north. Kennedy took PT-109 out of Lumbari Harbor as darkness fell on August 1st, with a 37mm gun installed that morning. A life raft that had been discarded to accommodate it, and a torpedo man at the forward turret who had spent weeks telling anyone who would listen that he was not going to come back. What does a commanding officer do with that? What do you say to a man who has decided with terrible precision that the next time the boat goes out is the last time?
That's I'm not sure. This I don't know. I'm enthralled by the story and the difficulties that they had to overcome. And I don't know what I would say. Honestly. This may be the first time I don't know what to say. No, maybe not. What would you say?
I would have had him removed.
You think so?
Oh yeah, it's a huge morale killer.
I
And
guess that
that would make him, in my opinion, unable to complete his duties.
I guess that's a factor I don't think about as often. When you think about the dynamics of military discipline and order, like what all needs to play into that. Yeah, I mean, esprit de corps is super important. I don't know. Is that, okay, let's say you're in a position where you're a very capable commander, or not even a commander, but just an element on a team, and you have this same morale killing attitude. Would there be a mechanism for them to correct that in you? Or is that something that can be done?
What should have happened in this situation is he should have been removed from the crew
Okay.
and put on medical leave and had a psychologist evaluate and treat
Okay.
him.
Makes sense. Yeah, I guess yeah, I don't know why I didn't think of that. That's true. Um, that seems pretty obvious now that you say it. Um, is that, uh, in your experience, is that something that, I mean, I don't think you went into any war zones per se.
Yeah, I did.
Oh, okay. Well, then tell me about, were there any crewmates that you had that experienced something similar?
Not to my knowledge, but there was
Okay.
also 5,000 plus.
Right. A humongous ship that I'm sure it could have happened and you wouldn't ever know just because you weren't in that team. Okay. The dynamics of psychology are something that interest me but elude me at the same time. It's just like sometimes I don't understand what the impact can be of somebody's actions. And so it's something I try to study. And so your description of what should have happened helps inform me of, oh, yeah, this would have been the correct measure. And by not doing so, here's the impact.
And
And I think
that's a
go.
failure of his leadership. Those resources were available in 1942 during this time.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my other question because I know psychiatry I guess, was developed in the late 1800s, mid 1800s maybe. And so how long did it take for the military to have folks on staff, or at least maybe, if not on staff, but connected in such a way that they could have aided in a situation like this? But if you're saying they were already there and available. Well, then, yeah, there's, I guess, no excuse.
Right. Well, I mean, it started in World War One when people finally started
Oh,
realizing that, keeping a man or a group of men in a trench for years destroys them psychologically.
hmm yeah.
This
Shell shock and
shell
all these.
shocks is starting
Hmm.
to become a thing, and people actually realizing it's not cowardice. We should not be shooting these guys for cowardice. This is
Right.
an
We
actual
are breaking
thing.
them.
Yes.
Right.
And of course, over the years, it develops, and during World War II, that's they oh yeah, we need to be rotating these guys through, not just leaving them there.
Right. And I'm sure that's one of the things that when we talk about events in the South Pacific specifically, how it just seems so remote and resupplying not just equipment, but people, like rotating these folks out, that seems to be really a logistical difficulty. Is that how would you rotate out sailors in such a remote location so close to um, a battlefield, so to speak? Battle sea? What do you how do you call that? Anyway, never mind. Go ahead.
A theater of operations.
Theater of operations. There we go. Ooh, that sounds way more proper.
It's because it is
Okay.
the same way you bring in new guys. You put the old guys, and they rotate back to an island that has been secured and is not under any direct threat, and they go for their R&R. That's also where all the psychiatrists are.
Okay. Well, that's okay. That helps me understand the dynamics of what exists in this time frame and how they should be employed. Yeah, and you make a good case of why he should have been removed. Thank you for illuminating my mind.
You're welcome. So the intelligence was good. That was the first thing, and it mattered because it meant the men who went out that night had reason to believe the plan made sense. American codebreakers, the same intelligence operation that handed Admiral Nimitz the Japanese order of battle at Midway 14 months later, had intercepted and deciphered the communications confirming the Tokyo Express run. By the end of July 1943, Commander Thomas Warfield at Lumbari had a confirmed report. Japanese destroyers were scheduled to run down the Blackett Strait on the night of August 1st, bound for Vila on the southern tip of Kulumbangara, where they would be delivering troops and supplies to the garrison there. 10,000 Japanese soldiers dug into a volcanic island, holding ground that stood directly in the path of the Allied advance up the chain. The destroyers would run south, offload, and then return before daylight. Warfeld knew they were coming. He had 15 PT boats. The math looked workable. That evening, in the blasted remains of a base that had been bombed that same morning, with PT-117 still wrecked on the dock and the hull of PT-164 underwater, Warfield briefed his 15 skippers. He organized them into 4 sections covering different positions across Blackett Strait and the approaches through Ferguson Passage. Division B, the northernmost section, stationed furthest up the strait on the western side of Kulumbangara, would be led by Lieutenant Henry Brantingham on PT-159. Brantingham had one critical advantage that most of the others did not: radar. PT-159 could see in the dark. Kennedy's PT-109 was assigned to Brantingham's section along with Lieutenant Liebeno's PT-157 and Lieutenant Lowry's PT-162. Kennedy's specific instruction was to follow PT-162 on her starboard quarter, which would keep him linked to the radar-equipped PT-159 by portable radio. In theory, when Brantingham made contact, the section would know. There was also supposed to be a harder backstop. Commander Arling Burke, one of the Navy's most aggressive destroyer officers, who would later become Chief of Naval Operations, had been ordered to position 7 American destroyers at the northern approach before the Japanese arrived. Okay? 7 destroyers sitting across the northern exit. If the PT boats couldn't stop the Express on the inbound run, Burke's force would be there to catch them on the return. It was a layered interception. On paper, it was sound. Here is what nobody in that briefing room knew yet. The Japanese destroyers came early. They arrived at Blackett Strait an hour ahead of schedule. Before Burke had reached his position, they threaded through the strait, offloaded 902 soldiers and their supplies onto barges at Vila, and turned north. Burke was still in transit. The first layer of the trap had closed on nothing. The 15 PT boats moved into position as darkness fell. They were through Ferguson Passage and at their stations by about 20:30 in the evening. The night was overcast, visibility poor. Kennedy's boat idled at the top of the formation, running quiet, watching the dark. Fog was coming in patches. The men at the guns and lookout stations strained at nothing. Brantingham found the Japanese first. Just after midnight, PT-159's radar picked up the southbound destroyers, already past their Vila delivery point on the return leg, heading north towards Rabaul. Brantingham moved to attack from about a mile out, swung into firing position, and put all 4 of PT-159's Mark 8 torpedoes in the water. As the last torpedo left the tube, the lubricating grease on the launcher caught fire. PT-159 lit up in the dark, a flare visible to every lookout on every Japanese destroyer in the strait. Lee Bonneau on PT-157, reading the situation, swung his boat in front of Brantingham's to block the light from his burning tubes, fired his own 2 remaining torpedoes, and missed. Both boats laid smoke and drove west towards Gizo Island to get clear of the Japanese guns. Not one of those 6 torpedoes hit anything. And here's the failure that sealed PT-109's fate. Never radioed the contact to the other boats. They simply left. When PT-159 departed west towards Gizo, she took her radar with her. When she left without transmitting, she took the information with her too. PT-109 received no signal, no warning, no report of destroyers in the area. The radio silence Warfield had issued, intended to prevent the Japanese from chatter, meant that skippers who heard nothing assumed nothing was happening. Kennedy's radio man, John McGuire, was monitoring the frequency. He was standing in the cockpit. Around the strait, in those same hours, 8 PT boats fired a total of approximately 30 torpedoes at the Japanese destroyers. The Navy's official action report would claim 5 or 6 torpedo hits. In reality, confirmed by post-war records and the testimony of Japanese survivors, not a single Mark 8 torpedo struck a Japanese ship that night. Some detonated prematurely, some ran at the wrong depth, some were simply duds. Mark 8 exploders still unreliable even after Nimitz had ordered them deactivated just 8 days before the mission. The boats that fired were ordered home by Warfield once their tubes were empty. One by one, they turned for Rendova. The Express had completed its mission and was moving north to Rabaul. By 0200 on August 2nd, the battle was effectively over. The Japanese had won on points. The Americans had fired 30 torpedoes and hit nothing. The garrison at Vila had been reinforced. Commander Warfield had specified no procedure, none, for what a division would do if a boat was lost. He had specified no procedure for survivor search. He had not clarified how long boats should remain on station after their section leader departed. 3 boats were still out there: PT-109, PT-162, and PT-169, operating under previously radioed orders to continue patrolling. Their section leader was gone. Their radar was gone. No warnings had reached them. They were spread across the strait in a loose picket line, running quietly on reduced power, looking into the dark. The Japanese destroyers, heading north at speed, were coming back through. Naval historian Captain Robert Buckley would later write the most precise verdict available on everything that had happened the night before PT-109 was hit. Quote, "This was perhaps the most confused and least effectively executed action the PTs had been in. 8 PTs fired 30 torpedoes. The only confirmed results were the loss of PT-109 and damage to the Japanese destroyer Amagi-ri. The damage to Amagi-ri was from striking PT-109. The 109 had not even fired yet. Every failure of the night was already complete. The intelligence had been good. The plan had not survived contact with the actual sequence of events. And 3 boats were still in the water, waiting in the dark, while 4 Japanese destroyers, mission accomplished, heading home, ran north at 40 knots."
What a calamity. That's pretty terrible. I want to ask you a question. I think I've asked before and it has been answered before, but I always like to have a little refresher in case new listeners come along and say, hey, what's up with that? Torpedoes.
Yes.
These are historically, in this era, the American torpedoes, the Mark 8s specifically that you mentioned, aren't great. They don't explode when they're supposed to. They're not as effective. So you could shoot 10 of them at an enemy and you'd be lucky to have just a handful explode. When launching a torpedo, even if it's effective, what controls are available as far as depth or distance before exploding, or are those programmable at all, or you just kind of launch it and hope it hits, or does it explode on impact, or what settings are controllable and how does it work?
There are settings that you can set on the torpedo itself. I'm not exactly sure how to mess with the settings, but you do have the settings for depth. You can set a timer for to explode if without contact, and there's contact explosion. You can also set speed, things of that nature.
Okay, well, yeah, that makes sense. I guess if you're gonna want to intercept a boat or ship, excuse me, you could slow it down so that it reaches the right place at the right time, or speed it up. Okay, and from a PT boat perspective, an 80-foot vessel seems small and large at the same time. What kind of capacity would it have for torpedoes?
It had 4 torpedoes.
Okay, that's not. This just seems like a very poorly. I don't know. PT boats seem like they would work in theory, but the fact that few of them had radar, and you're relying on stealth and speed effectively to do what you need to do, and your main weapon is ineffective, it just seems like a bad situation for the Americans. And especially in this situation, when you get a command from a radio and you're patrolling, but then the guy that sends you the command is taken out of action and your eyes are effectively gone. And so you're just wandering blind until all of a sudden a giant destroyer comes and crashes into your little boat. This is bad. I guess you said it much more eloquently, but this is just really bad. And I guess something is better than nothing. Maybe that's the attitude. From a recurring effectiveness standpoint, it's something. But yeah, I could see at the top you said, by the numbers, the Japanese walked away with a victory. And I'm trying to find out what any opposing viewpoint would be where the Americans did something substantial to slow or harm the Japanese effort in any way.
The first Blackett Strait at 02:30 in the morning of August 2nd, 1943. No moon, no stars. The cloud cover has settled in so completely that there is essentially no light gradient between the sea and the sky. No horizon line, no reference point, nothing to tell a man standing on a wooden deck which direction is up. Historian Stephen Plotkin, writing for the National Archives, described it as, quote, profoundly dark, inky blackness. And he was not being poetic. He was describing a navigational condition, the disorienting effects of a moonless, starless night on open water. He wrote, quote, should not be underestimated. Experienced sailors lost their sense of direction. They lost depth perception. Objects at 300 yards could appear at 50 or appear not at all. The second, PT-109, sitting in that dark, running on one engine. The center engine of the Elco 80-footer drove through a forward-facing V-drive gearbox, its output shaft angled aft through the center propeller shaft, which ran deeper in the water than the two wing shafts, and kicking up the smallest wake of the three. At idle on that single engine, PT-109 was making perhaps 6 to 8 knots, holding station, trying to be invisible. The transom mufflers were engaged, routing the exhaust underwater, suppressing both sound and spray. The men had learned, at the cost of a PT officer's life, to a tracking float plane somewhere in that same strait months before, that the one thing the Japanese could see in absolute darkness was the phosphorescent glow of a planing boat's wake. To run fast was to be found, so they sat in the dark and they listened. Kennedy was at the helm in the con. Radioman Second Class John McGuire stood to his right. Ensign Leonard Tham was to Kennedy's left. Just outside the con, Ensign George Barney Ross was at the bow, the newly lashed 37mm gun beside him, doing what a bow lookout does in the dark, pointing his eyes into nothing and hoping they would find something before something found him. Below decks, from that narrow passage between the three Packard engines, motor machinist mate First Class Patrick Pappy McMahon was doing routine maintenance. He had no idea anything was wrong. He had received no warning from the cockpit. And at the forward starboard gun turret, torpedoman Second Class Andrew Jackson Kirksey was on watch. His kapok life jacket was cinched tight to his cheeks. At approximately 0230, a shape materialized out of the black water, approximately 250 to 300 yards off PT-109's starboard bow. It was bearing down fast. No running lights, no signal, no sound that could be separated from the general noise of a diesel engine at idle. Motor machinist mate Harold Marney at the forward gun mount called it first. Ship at 2 o'clock. Kennedy and the others believed for several seconds that it was another PT boat. The shape was dark, low to the water, moving too fast to separate from the strait itself. Ensign Ross pointed from the bow. Someone called General Quarters. Less than 30 seconds had passed since the first sighting. At the same instant, he signaled the engine room for full power and spun the wheel to starboard, trying to turn PT-109's bow towards the oncoming shape. Not to evade, but to attack. To bring the torpedo tubes to bear and fire. To do the things PT boats existed to do. He also ordered Ross to man the 37mm gun. Ross reached for a shell for the breech and did not get it loaded in time. Here's what happened to the engines. The muffler system on the Elco 80-footer required the flaps to be opened before any serious throttle input. Bypass the underwater exhausting routing first, then apply power. That sequence at idle, in the dark, under stress, when a 2,000-ton destroyer is bearing down at 40 knots, took seconds that PT-109 did not have. Whether Kennedy signaled the engine room in time, whether McMahon below received the signal, whether the flaps were opened, those questions have been argued by naval historians for 80 years and have no definitive answer. What is beyond dispute is the outcome. The engines did not respond in any way that changed the trajectory of what came next. The official Navy's report verdict at the time available, scarcely 10 seconds elapsed between time of sighting and the crash. The Amagiri was a Fuboki-class destroyer, one of the most advanced destroyer designs in the world at her commissioning in 1930. Fast enough in 1943 to still run 40 knots. She displaced over 2,000 tons. She was more than 4 times the length of PT-109. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Kohei Hanami, and his superior captain, Katsumori Yamashiro, flotilla commander riding aboard, had 902 sailors at Vila and were running north for Rabaul at speed. In 10 seconds, nothing that Kennedy could have done to PT-109's propulsion changed the physics of what those 2,000 tons of steel at 40 knots were going to do to 56 tons of mahogany at 6. The Amagari struck PT-109 on the starboard side, approximately 15 feet from the bow, at a roughly 20-degree angle centerline. She did not hit the 109 squarely across. She crunched in diagonally and kept going, slicing the wooden hull the way a blade dragged at an angle across a surface leaves a longer cut than a straight chop. Ensign Ross at the bow, just feet from the impact point, would later describe it precisely. The destroyer, quote, caught us on the starboard bow at about a 20-degree angle to the longitudinal center of the boat. So it split the boat sort of long ways, not across the boat. It hit the bow up there about 5 feet from my right, and it continued on back, completely obliterating the starboard turret. The forward gun turret, the one closest to the impact, where Harold Marney had been standing 30 seconds before, was gone. Kirksey was gone. In the engine room, McMahon had no warning. He was reaching forward to wrench the starboard engine into gear when the Amagiri's bow entered his engine room. He was lifted from the narrow passage between the engines and slammed into the starboard bulkhead. The aviation gasoline in the ruptured gas tanks ignited. The fireball went 100 feet into the air. The sea caught fire. Kennedy was thrown hard against the cockpit bulkheads and landed on the deck on his back. He looked up at the Amagiri passing over him. Its peculiar raked, inverted wide smokestack lit in the explosion, larger than anything he had ever seen from that angle, from that distance. He had one coherent thought. He would later describe it to a reporter. Quote, "This is how it feels to be killed." The stern of PT-109 sank at the point of collision. One of the Packard engines had been knocked from its mount and went with it. The Amagiri's starboard propeller had been damaged by the impact. She would limp back to Rabaul at reduced speed, the only confirmed damage inflicted on the Japanese by 15 PT boats and 30 torpedoes that entire night. The forward section of PT-109, bow compartments intact, watertight bulkhead sealed, stayed afloat on the sealed forward sections, surrounded by burning sea. 5 men clung to it. Kennedy shouted, quote, "Over the side!" afraid the remaining fuel tanks would detonate. The men went into the water. The Amagiri's own passing wake, ironically, dispersed the worst of the flames around the hull. The two nearest PT boats, PT-162 and PT-169, had seen the fireball and the burning, launched 2 torpedoes at the Amagiri that missed. PT-162's torpedoes failed to fire at all. Both boats turned west and drove back towards Rendova without searching for survivors. No procedure had told them to. The skipper of one of those boats, seeing the sheet of flame on the water, covered his face with his hands and wept. Back at Lumbari, after a couple of days with no word, the squadron held a memorial service for the 13 men of PT-109. An officer wrote home, "Jack Kennedy, the ambassador's son, was on the same boat and also lost his life." Kennedy was on the forward section of his own ship, on fire around him, listening to see who would answer when he called. The question history was about to ask was not whether he survived. The question was what he would do in the hours and days that followed. What kind of man in the water would find him to be? What kind of man the water would find him to be? When the answer to that question was his alone to give.
This is this is a physics problem. Like, as you were describing the ship colliding with the PT boat, I just kept thinking, oh, this is just a physics problem, waiting for some student to calculate, the momentum, the force, the angle, what would happen, the strength of materials used on each side, and what their I guess, not hardness. I'm not sure what the word is that I'm looking for. But yeah, obliterated. Did the ship not see the boat, or was that just one of the things that they They're like, hey, we're just going to squish these little things like bugs because they're close.
Oh, I'm
It
sure
sounds like the way,
nobody saw anybody until the very
yeah,
last second.
yeah, that sounds, yeah, it doesn't sound effective. That's not an effective technique for ships to destroy other ships by ramming them, especially when the ship that you're targeting is so much smaller and more nimble.
Yeah. Since, the first AD.
Right, yeah. The battles in the Mediterranean. Golly, that's what a. I remember back when I said this is bad. It got worse. This is
And
crazy.
it's not over yet.
Oh my gosh, this is one of the things that when I hinted earlier that I had heard some aspects of John Kennedy's service in the military and how he commanded a PT boat, and they were very scarce with the details, but it made it sound like, oh, but he served honorably. I'm like, okay, well that's all I need to know. I'm a kid. I trust the news. Done. And so far, this is not the best situation. This is not a good. I'm gonna show up and get a boat after just pulling some strings. Hey, I've got this boat. Oh no, I've gotten it rammed by a much larger ship, even though my boat is way more nimble. I guess at the same time, in his defense, he was relying on radio communication from a ship that had radar equipped. And so the whole premise was I'm going to get orders and be told where to go. And I can't see anything anyway because it's so dark. Oh no, ship. So,
There were many systemic failures.
yeah, there's just a lot of things happened wrong at the wrong time. And boy, the, get the tonnage of that destroyer striking that tiny, relatively tiny mahogany boat is just astronomical. I mean, the closest thing I could think of that maybe an everyday American would experience is you're driving a car, like a compact car on the road, and then an 18-wheeler strikes you, but that's not even close. That's not even close to the amount of 40 knots with over 2,000 tons. That's insane. And
Plus, an
yeah,
18-wheeler doesn't have a pointed bow.
true. That's right. It doesn't have a knife edge on the front. Ay, that's anyway, this is a calamity. If there's, I'm trying to think of what a stronger word for calamity would be.
Disaster.
Uh, yeah, disaster. This is a complete disaster for the Americans. Um, yep, that's that's the right word. Okay, well, let's see if this is redeemed somehow or if it happens to get worse.
He got to his feet on the deck of what was left of his boat and called into the dark. Mr. Kennedy! Mr. Kennedy! McMahon is badly hurt. That voice was gunner's mate Charles Harris, somewhere in the water to the south, before Kennedy could go for him. He had to know who else, but before Kennedy could go for him, he had to know who else was alive. He stood on the tilted, burning, smelling deck and shouted across the surface of Blackett Strait. One by one, they answered. Ensign George Ross from somewhere in the dark. Then enlisted men, Harris again, Johnston, Zinser, Starkey, Radioman McGuire, and Cook Maurer were already on the floating section with Kennedy and Thom. Ensign Thom and Ross pulled in motor machinist mate Gerald Zinser, torpedoman Ray Starksky, and motor machinist William Johnston, who had swallowed aviation gasoline and fuel oil when the blast threw him into the burning sea, and who was barely functional, barely conscious, debilitated by the fumes in his lungs and the poison in his stomach. Two did not answer. Kirksey, Marney. No one would ever know exactly what became of them. The impact had obliterated the turret where they stood. No body was ever found. Kennedy told Quartermaster Maurer to keep blinking the lantern so the men in the water could see where the hull was. Stripped off his shoes, shirt, and the sidearms at his waist, and dove into the Blackett Strait. McMahon was 100 yards from the boat, in the dark, in open water, with a current moving against him. 100 yards might as well have been a mile. When Kennedy reached him, he asked, "How are you, Mac?" McMahon answered, "I'm all right. I'm kind of burnt." He was burned over 70% of his body. His face, his chest, his arms, his legs. He had fought his way out of the engine room through fire that should have killed him and was still alive in a body that was not going to cooperate with anything he tried to do. He told Kennedy to leave him. "Just leave me. I'll be all right by myself." Kennedy took the strap of McMahon's Capote life jacket in his teeth and began pulling him back towards the hull. It took 3 hours. The hull was 100 yards away. It took 3 hours because the current kept pulling against them, and because Kennedy was swimming in the dark with nothing to guide him but a small blinking light, and because the man he was towing had no effective use of his limbs, could not reduce his own drag by a single motion. Between each interval of breaststroke, Kennedy stopped, rested, and started again. 15 minutes pulling, then rest, then 15 minutes more. When he reached the hull, he left McMahon on the floating section and went back out for Harris, who had a hurt leg and kept stopping. Kennedy cajoled him. Kennedy berated him. Kennedy told him to keep moving and didn't soften it when Harris slowed down. By the time both men were on the hull, the sky was beginning to gray. 11 men clung to the forward section of PT-109 as it drifted slowly south through the morning of August 2nd. Johnston lay on the tilted deck, too poisoned by the fuel he had swallowed to contribute anything, barely conscious. The hull was listing. It was settling lower in the water with each passing hour. By noon, it was clearly going under. The watertight compartments that had kept the forward section afloat all night were losing their battle, and the drift was the worst part. The current was carrying them south, towards Gizo, Japanese held, Japanese garrisoned, and close enough to see the dark mass of its shoreline from the bow. Kennedy looked at the islands around him. Hold what he saw. Kulumbangara to the northeast, 10,000 Japanese troops. Gizo to the southwest, Japanese base. Arundel, Japanese. Every island with a population had a Japanese population. Kennedy picked the one that had no population at all. Plum Pudding Island. A speck of sand and sparse trees barely visible to the southwest, 3.5 miles away. He told the men, quote, "We will swim to that small island. We have less chance of making it than some of these other islands here, but there'll be less chance of Japanese too." Johnston couldn't swim. Maurer couldn't swim. They lashed the 2 men to a timber that had been part of the 37mm gun mount, and 7 men pushed and pulled it across 3.5 miles of open Pacific. McMahon's Capote in his teeth. He swam breaststroke. 15 minutes, then rest. Then 15 more, then rest. For 4 hours, towing a man who could not move his own arms against a cross current, through water that was home to oceanic white-tipped sharks, and in those channels, saltwater crocodiles. Kennedy reached Plum Pudding Island first. He collapsed on the beach. He vomited seawater into the sand. He had to be helped up the beach by Patrick McMahon, who rose on burned legs and arms and used what he had left to pull the men who had just towed him 4 miles to his feet. The island the men called Bird Island, after the layer of guano coating the leaves, was 100 yards long and 40 yards wide. There was no fresh water. The coconuts were green and hard and inedible. There were no Allied boats visible on the horizon in any direction. Moments after the crew concealed themselves in the trees, a Japanese barge chugged along the beach, close enough to see detail on its hull. Kennedy rested for a few hours. Then at sundown, he left. He stripped to his underwear. He tied his .38 revolver around his neck. He wrapped an electric lantern in a life jacket to keep it dry. The men begged him not to go. He went anyway. The plan, if it could be called that, was to island hop the reefs southeast towards Ferguson Passage, the route the PT boats use when operating in Blackett Strait. and to flag one down and bring rescue back to the crew. He made it to the passage. He treaded water and open ocean for approximately an hour, holding the lantern, listening for engine sound in the dark. No boats came. He began the swim back. The current took him. It spun him east into Blackett Strait, and then, as he fought back, back west into Ferguson Passage. Again, he lost his lantern. He lost his bearings. John Hershey would later write of that moment, based on Kennedy's own account, that his mind, quote, seemed to float away from his body. At some point before dawn, the tide reversed. The changed current carried him back towards where he had begun. He made Leorava Island, barely a sandbar, barely above the waterline, a strip of nothing in the dark, and crawled ashore and collapsed. The coral had cut his feet and legs open. He slept. He stumbled back to Plum Pudding at noon on August 3rd. He had been gone 18 hours. The men on the island had believed him dead. There is a version of that Ferguson Passage swim that calls what Kennedy did courage. There is another version that calls it reckless, leaving 11 men who were alive because of him to go alone into the enemy water in the dark, on a plan with no margin for error, in a place where the margin had already been eaten completely by the night of August 2nd. The honest answer may not be the difference between courage and recklessness, is largely determined after the fact by whether the man comes back.
Okay, so I'm starting to get some of the appeal and, I guess, mystery around what Kennedy was able to do. When you are faced with your ship being absolutely obliterated by an enemy vessel in enemy waters, your options are pretty limited. You got one guy who may have said the understatement of the 20th century about how he's a little burnt and can't swim, right? Like, imagine getting these burns and then falling into salt water. That's all I could think about when you were sharing that story. And then you're like, okay, of all the places we can swim to, some are closer, some are farther. That one doesn't have enemy on it, but it's the least equipped, least hospitable one, and fairly far. And I'm going to swim and tow you guys that can't swim. That's pretty noble. That's pretty. That's not for the weak-willed. And I can see a guy like that who wants to be in the place where the action is, finding himself in the action and then having to respond. I mean, it seems like earlier in the story he was faced with some difficult situations, some that may have been his fault, some that certainly were not. But when it came down to this situation, he was very decisive, and he endured the sacrifice of God. Like, I'm not a strong swimmer myself. I can't imagine swimming, what was it, 3.5 miles in a cross current in dangerous seas. That and towing people, right? That's incredible. I really admire that. And then after that, saying, oh, okay, this is not a hospitable place. I'm gonna see if I can swim and get us help. And that is a suicide mission, frankly. It's a miracle he survived, in my opinion. But that is courage. And I think that kind of, I know some could also call it reckless, that it's a little bit of both for sure. But I don't know. I admire recklessness when it's in the right situation. You know what I mean? It's like, look, my guys are hurt. They need help. And I'm going to go do what I can to see it that they're saved. And that's not a, you could try to plan and see what you could do to make it as safe as possible, which, that is reasonable, but sometimes there's just no safe option. And time is of the essence and urgency is required. And that's what I see here. And so kudos to John Kennedy, even though all he got was a return trip back to Plum Pudding Island. Best name of an island I've ever heard, by the way. And then feet and legs cut up by coral. I know that the fighting on the various islands in the South Pacific was difficult. It sounds like the waters were also quite difficult. So very dangerous. And yet they're holding on as best they can.
Kennedy stumbled back on the morning of August 3rd and slept through the day on the sand. When he woke, nothing had changed. The men were alive. The Japanese owned every island visible from the beach. The coconuts were inedible. There was no fresh water, and whatever they were going to do next was going to require more swimming. Over the next 2 days, the survivors moved. August 4th, Kennedy led the crew on another crossing, 3.75 miles this time, to Olasana Island, against a hard current. McMahon in tow again, a plank with the non-swimmers pushing through the chop alongside. August 5th, Kennedy and Ensign Ross swam alone to Nauru Island, the last in the chain, whose eastern shore opened directly onto Ferguson Passage. They found something on Nauru, the wreck of a small Japanese vessel on the reef, a tin of drinkable water in the brush, a box of Japanese hard candy, a one-man canoe hidden in the tree line. Small mercies after 5 days of nothing. The crack in the wall came not from any of this. It came from two young Malaysian men in a dugout canoe who had been looking for them since August 2nd. Hold two things in your mind simultaneously. The first, John Kennedy, exhausted, back damaged, malaria weakened, swimming open ocean for the 5th consecutive day, looking for a way to save 11 men. The second, Biuku Gasa and Enroni Komana, two Solomon Islander scouts trained by Australian Coast Watcher Sub-Lieutenant Arthur Reginald Evans, paddling their dugout canoe through Japanese-controlled waters in systematic search patterns for the crew of a missing American patrol boat, as they had been since the morning after the explosion. Evans was operating from a secret observation post on Mount Veve, the summit of the Kulumbagara volcano, deep in the center of an island garrisoned by 10,000 Japanese troops. From that post, he watched and reported Allied and Japanese movements across Blackett Strait. On the night of August 2nd, from his mountaintop, he had seen the fireball. By morning, he had decoded confirmation. The explosion was probably PT-109. He dispatched Gasa and Kumana immediately to search for survivors. Enroni Kumana was approximately 18 years old in August of 1943. Bigoku Gasa was 20. Both had been schooled by Seventh-day Adventist missionaries. Both spoke limited English, and both had been risking their lives in Japanese waters as scouts and intelligence assets for months before PT-109 went down. Kumana had previously rescued two downed American pilots who had parachuted into the sea. This is what they did as a matter of routine. They were not famous for it because the Allied Command's intelligence operations required that Coast Watcher networks remain secret. Their names never even appeared in newspapers. Gasa and Kumana found the surviving crew on Ulasana. The initial encounter was tense. The crew feared they were Japanese. Ensign Tom broke the standoff by asking Gasa if he knew Scout John Kari. Gasa replied that he worked with him. The scouts brought yams, vegetables, and cigarettes from their canoe. On August 6th, Kennedy met them on Nauru with Ross. They needed to send a message. There was no paper, no pen. Gasa plucked a green coconut from a nearby palm tree and showed Kennedy how to scratch words into the husk with his knife. Kennedy cut in. Nauru Isle. Commander. Native knows post. He can pilot. 11 alive. Needs small boat. Kennedy. Tom had written a penciled backup note. Both messages were placed in Gassa's canoe. Gassa and Kumana paddled 38 miles through enemy water overnight, 15 consecutive hours of paddling, to deliver them to the nearest Allied base. They stopped first at Wana Wana Island to link up with senior scout Benjamin Kevu, who had already been notified by Evans and provided a better canoe for the final leg. Gassa, Kumana, and scout John Kari covered the remaining distance to Rendova, the coconut in Gassa's hands, through patrols that would have killed them if found. Commander Warfield did not believe them. He had no prior relationship with these scouts. He had no way to verify the coconut message or the penciled note. He found the entire scenario suspicious. The man who held a memorial service for the 13 lost men of PT-109 5 days earlier was now being presented with a carved coconut and 2 young islanders claiming the skipper was alive. It was Evans' radio confirmation that turned the key. And even then, Warfield cautiously consented to risk 2 PTs for the rescue. He selected PT-157, commanded by Lieutenant William Lenbona, Kennedy's own section mate from the Division B patrol, along with PT-171. Kennedy was paddled to Gomu Island on the evening of August 7th, hidden under a pile of palm fronds in the bottom of a canoe as the scouts moved through Japanese patrol waters in daylight. He met Evans that evening. The man who had watched PT-109 burn from his mountaintop and set the entire rescue network in motion, and whom Kennedy would not publicly name for years because exposing the Coast Watcher network was not something the Allied command permitted. The rescue signal was planned. 4 shots. Kennedy had 3 rounds left in his revolver. Evans handed him a rifle for the 4th. Standing in a canoe to fire the signal shot, Kennedy did not account for the rifle's recoil. It knocked him overboard. He was fished out of Blackett Strait by his own rescuers. 6 days and 6 hours after the Amagiri cut PT-109 in half, the men of 109 were going home. Across Blackett Strait, in the early hours of August 8th, the PT boats eased up Olasana Island, and the 11 men were all asleep. Kennedy started calling for them. The rescuers told them to be quiet. They were still in range of Japanese positions. He kept calling. The men of PT-109 were carried aboard and taken back to Rendova, where they arrived at 05:30 in the morning and were given sandwiches and brandy and medical attention, and where at least one of them wept. Here's what was happening in those same waters while Kennedy was still stranded. On the night of August 6th and 7th, one day before the rescue, Admiral William Halsey, now completely convinced that PT boats could not be trusted against Japanese destroyers, dispatched 6 American destroyers equipped with the newest radar to intercept Express in Vila Gulf. In one clean, coordinated night action, the Battle of Vila Gulf. Remember that?
I do.
Those 6 destroyers sank 4 Japanese destroyers and killed approximately 1,000 Japanese soldiers, with 0 American casualties. The contrast required no commentary. On August 1st, 15 PT boats fired 30 torpedoes and hit nothing. 6 days later, 6 destroyers with radar and doctrine reduced the Tokyo Express to wreckage in one engagement. Halsey ordered PT boats converted to gunboats. Kennedy would command one, PT-59, stripped of its own torpedo tubes and fitted with guns and armor for the remainder of his Pacific service. And then there was Seaman Second Class Raymond Albert of Akron, Ohio, the man who had been at his station on the forward section when PT-109 went down, who had swum back to the hull on his own, who had made the crossing to Plum Pudding and every island after it, who had been rescued on August 8th and lived. On October 8th, 1943, 6 weeks later, Albert was killed by a Japanese prisoner of war during a rescue mission. He was 21 years old. His name appears in almost none of the popular accounts of PT-109. 3 men from that crew died before the war was over. The 2 who died in the collision are known. Albert is the one who survived everything Kennedy survived, and then didn't come home. The two men who saved the 11 survivors of PT-109 by padding 38 miles through enemy water were mentioned in no military reports of significance. They appeared in no newspaper. They were not in the 1963 film. Kennedy invited Bukugarasa and Aroni Komatna to his presidential inauguration in January of 1961. British, British colonial officials in Honduras turned them back at the airport. Their appearance and pidgin English, it was determined, would be an embarrassment. They went home. The coconut shell that Bioku Gasa had suggested and Kennedy had carved sat in the desk in the Oval Office for nearly 3 years. The men who carried it across 38 miles of Japanese water were still living off coconuts and fish in the Western Solomons.
Undoubtedly, after almost a week being stranded, I was thinking, with no access to fresh water, um, that would be, people would be on the verge of death and possibly madness. And it seems like the Navy knew this, and brandy is the solution. And sandwiches, which I appreciate that they had those on hand. Golly, that's just what a harrowing. I know that we talk a lot about battles and kind of these big explosions that happen on carriers, and that sometimes tens to hundreds, maybe even thousands of men that are cut down in single engagements. But again, what I appreciate is the focus on what the human experience is in all of this. And yes, you've survived boat being torn asunder by an enemy destroyer. You've managed to swim to safety, but now begins quite a lot of suffering. Or not begins. It I think for the burn guy especially, he's been suffering a while. And what a contrast. I remember talking about that engagement a few episodes ago, maybe last episode. And it was such a devastating, like a Navy equipped with radar, just able to just absolutely crush the Japanese, and they were completely unsuspecting. That was awesome. And this was I mean, I don't mean in the, oh, totally awesome, dude case, but like it was just mouth agape, like, wow, I can't believe how effective that was. And to contrast that with 30 torpedoes that did not work, well, that's the wrong strategy. And surely Kennedy, I'm sure, got some kind of citation or medal for what he did from the Navy, because that seems, in spite of all the everything that went wrong, that again, I think demonstrated some gallantry. And wow, what a crazy story. You know what I mean? It's so funny how history is peppered with all these little things that happen that sounds so outrageous. I mean, a message on a coconut. Are you serious? But it happened, and that's nearly unbelievable. And I'm glad we get to talk about these stories and bring life to them and attention to them to people that might otherwise never have heard it. Like I did not know the details here, and I'm astonished.
Is what the United States Navy's professional record says about the night of August 1st and 2nd, 1943. 8 PT boats fired 30 torpedoes. The only confirmed results were the loss of PT-109 and minor damage to the Japanese destroyer Amagiri. The damage from striking PT-109. The Japanese supply mission was completed. The garrison of Vila was reinforced. The Express ran home. The two PT boats closest to PT-109 when she was struck, PT-162 and PT-169, saw the fireball, launched ineffective torpedoes at the departing Amagiri, and drove back to Rendova without searching for survivors. Commander Warfield had specified no procedure for survivor search. A memorial service was held for the 13 dead of PT-109 2 days later. An officer wrote home announcing the deaths. That is the record. The question of what the record doesn't say is where the history gets harder. Commander Warfield, the man who planned and commanded the night's operation, later assessed Kennedy as, quote, not a particularly good boat commander. Lieutenant Commander Jack Gibson, who succeeded Warfield, was more specific. Quote, he lost the 109 through very poor organization of his crew. Everything he did up until he was in the water was the wrong thing. These are not anonymous critics. These are Kennedy's own chain of command. A Naval Board of Inquiry was convened, cleared, not at fault for the loss, but the clearing was not accompanied by a finding that he had performed well. It was a finding that given the conditions, the darkness, the absence of radar, the radio silence, the 10 seconds from sighting to impact, a different outcome was not reasonably achievable. What the board did not know, and what the record does not contain, is what Kennedy told Lieutenant Ted Robinson in the weeks after the collision. Robinson was a fellow PT skipper, lost his boat that summer. He and Kennedy were tent mates at Tulagi, recovering and waiting to see what came next. In one of their late night conversations, Kennedy had told him what happened. Robinson would not put it in writing until 1999, when he published his account in Naval History magazine. The key line, as Robinson reported it, Kennedy said, quote, Robbie, I failed to open my flaps. Here's what that means. The Elco's 80-footer engines were fitted with mufflers on the transom, routing exhaust underwater and suppressing both sound and wake. Those muffler flaps had to be bypassed before a skipper could throttle up to combat speed. The sequence was open the flaps first, then apply power. If you applied power without opening the flaps, the back pressure stalled the engines. Kennedy's admission to Robinson was this. When he saw Amagari bearing down, his instinct was to throw the throttles forward. He did so without opening the flaps. The engine stalled. PT-109 sat dead in the water for whatever seconds remained. The public record says something different. McMahon, the only man in the engine room, told every interviewer for the rest of his life that he received no signal from the cockpit before the collision. No warning. Radioman McGuire, standing next to Kennedy in the cockpit, later said Kennedy signaled the engine room, but couldn't say whether the signal was received or acted on. The private admission and the public account, direct tension. Both were maintained consistently by separate men for decades. When you keep the same story straight for that long, with that much alignment between the principles, it is not by accident. Naval historian Lieutenant Commander Thomas Cutler, writing in Naval History magazine in 2023, made the most technically precise assessment available. Even if the engines had responded fully, given Amagari's speed and distance of a few feet in where the destroyer struck PT-109's hull, the collision was not survivable under the circumstances by whatever margin a muffled engine could have found. What Kennedy may have withheld, what McMahon may have confirmed by silence, was the difference between accident and error. Both of them apparently preferred to keep that distinction private. Joe Kennedy Jr. had different questions. He was 28 years old in the summer of 1943, a naval bomber pilot stationed in Norfolk, waiting for deployment to Europe. He was taller than his brother, healthier, the son their father had always publicly designed for the presidency. When John Hershey's Survival appeared in The New Yorker in June 1944, and their father had helped engineer its placement, reaching out through connections to get the story told in the right places, Joe wrote his brother a letter. Quote, were you when the destroyer hove into sight, and exactly what were your moves? Kennedy never answered. He never answered that letter from the only person in his family whose own military service gave him standing to ask the question on equal terms. On August 12, 1944, 10 days after the first anniversary of PT-109 sinking, Joe Kennedy Jr. was killed flying a secret mission called Operation Aphrodite over the English Channel. He was in an aircraft converted to a remote controlled flying bomb packed with explosives intended to crash into German V 2 weapon installations on the Belgium coast. The detonation triggered prematurely. Nothing was recovered. He was 29. The question he asked was never answered by the only man who could answer it, because by the time Kennedy could have answered it, his brother was gone. Now, here's what remains of PT 109 in the physical world: the stern section, the aft half of the boat, with its engines, its fuel tanks, and the turret where Kirksey and Marnie died, sank at the collision point in Blackett Strait on the night of August 2nd, 1943. It has never been found. Robert Ballard, who found the bow section in 2002, searched for the stern for 4 days before abandoning the effort. Whatever lies at the actual site of the collision, if anything identifiable remains, has not been located by any expedition since. The bow section is a different story. It drifted approximately 5 miles south through the morning of August 2nd, driven by the current, and then sank at approximately 1 p.m. or 1300 when the sealed compartments finally failed. In May of 2002, Ballard's National Geographic expedition found it approximately 1,200 feet down the southeastern end of Blackett Strait, near the entrance of Ferguson Passage. What he found: one Mark 18 torpedo tube, caked in coral and rust. One Mark 8 torpedo still partially inside it. A PT boat training gear, the cranking mechanism used to aim the tube, positioned exactly as it would have been on an intact boat. It wouldn't move when the ROV pushed it. Dale Ritter, the Weapons and Explosive Authority on the identification panel, confirmed, quote, "Given all the evidence presented, it appears to be the PT-109. The mahogany hull is almost certainly gone. Tropical waters at that depth, with its oxygen content and wood borers, consumes mahogany within years. What the sonar showed, partially buried in the shifting sand dunes of the seafloor, was a hard target approximately 7 meters wide, roughly PT-109's beam, suggesting metal components still buried beneath the surface. Engines, gas tanks, hardware, the remnants of what was once a boat. The U.S. Navy owns the wreck. It always will. Navy policy prohibits disturbance of American war vessels on the seafloor. Ballard put it plainly, quote, "I think it's a grave, and it's a gropos, showing us enough to know, but burying the rest." He was right that something is buried. What is buried at the actual collision point where Kirksley and Marnie died has not been shown to anyone. It may never be. The stern of PT-109 is still somewhere in the Blackett Strait, in the dark at the bottom of the Pacific, unlocated. And what that place holds may be the only part of this story that will stay permanently closed.
I think this is a very it's just you summed it up so well when it was just a collection of unfortunate situations that compounded to become something that nobody could necessarily foresee. A lot of this is we're trying new things. I mean, the whole premise of the PT boat program was let's try something new. And I think it could have been successful. But there were so many factors that the lack of maintenance and repair and rotating people out and the lack of effective torpedoes, like there were so many things against it from the onset, much less their fighting capability in theater. This was bound to happen based on all the decisions that were made, based on how things were deployed. I know radar was a newer technology. Deploying it on a smaller boat, probably not economically feasible or maybe even physically feasible. This it's just a collection of bad situations. I am glad that the Navy was quick enough to say, yeah, this failed. Let's not do this anymore. Let's go back to destroyer warfare, and all those PT boats that we do have, let's convert them to gunboats, and then they can have some utility, but just not what we had before. Eliminating those torpedo tubes was the first right step in using those boats for an effective purpose. And again, we saw gallantry on display, adaptability by the Navy, and an attempt to try something new in the face of an enemy that seemed very dominant, and we just needed to throw something at them that would slow them down or stop them. This didn't work, so let's not do that anymore. We see that over and over again, and I find it very encouraging. The Navy is willing to try, fail, and then adapt quickly until they find success, because as we've covered in a lot of our previous episodes recently, they found a bunch of success in trying new things, and this episode is just an example that it's not always a guarantee. And I think that's really important to know. When you try, it doesn't mean you're going to hit. And so, but you still need to be willing to roll with the punches. And that's what the Navy did with the PT boat program. And that's what Kennedy did once his boat was cut in half. It's like, well, here we are. What's next? And you make decisions accordingly. I think these are good lessons.
PT-109 did not change the strategic situation in Blackett Strait. The garrison at Vila was reinforced. The Tokyo Express completed its run. The engagement of August 1st and 2nd, 1943, accomplished nothing its planner set out to accomplish. 30 torpedoes, 1 American boat lost, 0 Japanese ships sunk. By every professional military measure, the mission was a failure, and PT-109's loss was the proof. What PT-109 changed was something the Navy's after-action reports had no column for. She carried her commanding officer through the crucible that defined him. She put him in the water where he found out what he was made of, and found out what his back could take, and what his body could sustain, and what his men would follow him through. And the answer, at 25 in shark water at midnight in enemy territory, with 2 men dead and 11 to account for, was more than most men ever discover about themselves. Decades later, quote, without PT-109, there never would have been a President John F. Kennedy. Praise or indictment depends on your view of the presidency. What it is factually is probably true. But the part of PT-109's story that goes unsaid is the part that belongs to everyone whose name isn't Kennedy. This boat earned a battle star in Iron Bottom Sound before her most famous skipper ever stepped aboard. Fired a torpedo in combat. She ran the channels off Guadalcanal in the dark for months, against destroyers, under flares, with Japanese shore batteries bracketing her hull. Then she came back to Shishappi with holes in her planking and her crew exhausted and still alive. None of that is the story that most people knew. None of those men are famous. This section is for them. The commanding officers of PT-109 in the order they served. Ensign Bryant L. Larson, Watertown, from her delivery on June 16, 1942, through 9 months of hard Pacific service, through Iron Bottom Sound and the Guadalcanal campaign, through the shell holes in her hull at Cape Esperanzas, and the depth charge 150 yards off her port quarter. The man who had this boat before Kennedy, who kept her running, who had handed her off still fighting. Ensign Leonard J. Thom, Sandusky, Ohio, who held command for 4 days when Larson left, who was Kennedy's right hand every night after, and who received his own Navy and Marine Corps medal for what he did in the water on August 2nd. Lieutenant Junior Grade John Fitzgerald Kennedy, Boston, Massachusetts, who commanded her from April 24, 1943, until Amagari cut her in half on August 2nd, and who spent 6 days in Japanese waters trying to make up for what happened on the night it did. The crew aboard PT-109 on their last mission. Ensign George H.R. Barney Ross, Highland Park, Illinois, a friend who had lost his own boat and came aboard as an observer, who stood at the bow in the dark with a 37mm gun he never had time to reload. Radioman, second class, John E. McGuire, Dobbs Ferry, New York. The man whose post was below deck monitoring the radio. The messages that could have warned them, but who was standing in the cockpit beside his skipper when the shape appeared. Quartermaster, third class, Endman Edgar Maurer, St. Louis, Missouri. The cook, the signalman, the man who blinked the lantern in the dark so the men in the water could find the hull. One of two men who could not swim, lashed to a plank and pulled 4 miles by men who could. Motor machinist's mate, second class, William Johnston, Dorchester, Massachusetts. The other man who could not swim, who swallowed aviation fuel and survived it, was pulled to Bird Island on the same plank across the same 3.5 miles. Gunner's mate, third class, Charles A. Bucky Harris, Watertown, Massachusetts, who had a hurt leg in the water after the collision, who heard Kennedy berating him to keep moving in the dark, and who did. Torpedoman's mate, second class, Ray L. Starsky, Garden Grove, California, who was thrown by the blast, who swam back on his own, who made every island with the rest. Motor machinist mate, first class, Gerald E. Zinzer, Belleville, Illinois, listed as Gerald in almost every book ever written about PT-109, a mistake that irritated him for 58 years, the last surviving member of PT-109. He died in Florida in 2001. Motor machinist mate, first class, Patrick H. Pappy McMahon, Wyanett, Illinois. The oldest man on the crew, who enlisted at 37 because his stepson enlisted and he could not face him otherwise, who was in the engine room when Amagari entered it, 70% of his body, and still made it to the deck, who told Kennedy to leave him behind, who, when Kennedy collapsed on the beach of Plum Pudding Island after 4 hours of towing him, rose on his burned legs and helped his skipper up the sand. He died in 1990 at age 84. He called Kennedy skipper for the rest of his life. Seaman, second class, Raymond Albert, Akron, Ohio, age 21, who survived the collision, the water, the swims, the 6 days, the rescue, who was killed by a Japanese prisoner of war on October 8, 1943, 6 weeks later, during a rescue mission. His name appears in almost none of the popular accounts of PT-109. He was one of the 13. He deserves to be one of the 13. And the two who did not answer when Kennedy called. Torpedo men, second class, Andrew Jackson Kirksey, Reynolds, Georgia, age 25, who has spent the last weeks of his life certain he was going to die, who kept his life jacket cinched to his cheeks at his battle station. Amagi-ri obliterated it. No one saw what happened to him. His body was never recovered. Motor machinist mate, second class, Harold William Marney, Springfield, Massachusetts, age 20, who manned the turret closest to the point of impact, who is the youngest of the dead, who is the least known of any of them. There is no memorial in Reynolds, Georgia, for Kirksey. There is no memorial in Springfield, Massachusetts, for Marney. Their names are on PT-109's service record, which is held by the National Archives. The stern of PT-109, the half of the boat where they died, has never been found. It is somewhere in Blackett Strait, 1,200 feet down in the dark, the property of the United States Navy, undisturbed. Kennedy carried the weight of those two names for the rest of his life. His tent mate, Robinson, watched him around Tulagi, afterwards with a cane, thin and sunburned. He saw it in him. The skipper who drove his boat hard and recklessly in the months that followed, who volunteered for the worst missions, who pulled Marines off a burning landing craft under fire. His friend, Alan Cluster, would say later it was guilt driving him. The guilt of losing his 2 crewmen, the guilt of losing his boat, and of not being able to sink a Japanese destroyer. Whether that is true, only Kennedy knew. He never said, next to the decisions of the Cold War. On November 22nd, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, he was wearing a rigid back brace. Threw him against the bulkhead in Blackett Strait, 20 years before. Medical analysis concluded that the brace held him upright after the first shot struck him, preventing him from slumping forward, leaving him exposed for the second. Enro ni Komana, the young islander who paddled 38 miles through Japanese water with a carved coconut, who had never received recognition in his lifetime proportional to what he did, died on August 2nd, 2014, exactly 71 years after Amagiri cut PT-109 in half at Blackest Strait. He was 96 years old. He knew what day it was. Motor torpedo boat, PT-103 class, Elko Naval Division, Bayonne, New Jersey. Keel laid 4 March 1942, launched 20 June, delivered 10 July. 2 battle stars, 3 commanding officers, 13 men on her final mission, 3 who did not come home. She was a plywood boat. She was 80 foot long. She was nobody's idea of a warship. And she is still out there, what's left of her, somewhere in the dark at the bottom of the Pacific, keeping her dead.
What a story. What a profile in, I think, courage. Really. I know growing up, there were lots of folks who had a spectrum of opinions on the kind of person John F. Kennedy was, the kind of leader he was. And as a youth, it's hard to know what to trust or what to align with sometimes. But what is clear are the facts of the matter. And I think that showcases something. You know, say what you will about any number of his policies or the string pulling that got him into the situation in the first place. In that moment, he was the man that his crew needed him to be. And that matters. And when you talk about how he had vertebral problems or a compressed spine, and yet he still committed to swimming miles to save his men, that's extraordinary. I'm glad I know more about this story, and I'm glad I know more about the PT boat program. And now I also understand why I haven't heard very much about it since. Did not go great. And that, again, is okay in the big picture because the Navy was able to learn from some pretty tough lessons. And I think that's an important example for all of us. Try new things, learn, adapt, and grow. And that's what we see here. Oh, and also show up when you're needed.
Take us out.
Oh, okay. I was wondering what the hand. Okay.
I was trying to be silent until you could naturally merge right into it.
Okay. Yeah. So, yeah. And with that said, I think it's a good time to wrap up. So thank you so much, listeners, for joining us on this journey and learning more about some of our collective history. If you ever want to reach out to us for any reason, but about this specifically even, there's a couple different ways you could do that. One, you can email us at usnavyhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also catch us on X Twitter with the handle USNHistoryPod. And if you look in those show notes, you'll find that information plus links to a Discord server that we have. You just jump on in and say, hey, I want to talk about that latest episode. And we're like, fine, that's why we're here. Be our guest, literally. And also, if you enjoyed this episode or any number of other episodes and you think other people would enjoy it too, tell people about it. It helps us, and hopefully it helps the people that you recommend it to be edified and learn maybe the more human side of some of our history, as well as some of the lesser known stories that I certainly didn't learn about in the history books. So, again, thanks for being here, and hope to catch you next time.
And with that, we're going to wish you guys fair winds and following seas. Goodbye.